Welcome everyone to this live public event on transatlantic cooperation in the era of artificial intelligence, co-organized by the Atlantic Council's GeoTech Center and the Future Europe Initiative. I'm Paula Dobriansky. I'm an Atlantic Council board member, and I also am vice chair of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. We have a very esteemed group of speakers with us today, representing the European Commission, NATO, and the United States. Let me share with you who you will be hearing from. We have the European Commission's Executive Vice President, Chef de Cabinet, Ambassador Kim Jørgensen. We have NATO's Deputy Secretary General, Mircea Geoană. We have the chair of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, Dr. Eric Schmidt, and also the NSCAI Chair, Secretary Robert Work. The development of artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies is extremely critical. Most of them are paradigm shifting and multidisciplinary, transforming everything from national security to healthcare sectors, telecommunications, manufacturing, and even more. Accordingly, governments and multinational organizations have recognized the importance of AI advancement. Now, when we look back in August of 2018, the United States Congress established the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence to advance the development of AI to address the country's national security needs. In October of 2020, the Commission released its third quarter interim report and recommendations memo. Now, likewise, the European Commission in February published its white paper on artificial intelligence and also the European data strategy. And then NATO released its own report, Artificial Intelligence Implication for NATO's Armed Forces in May. Among the new recommendations in the NSCAI report is an NSA, it's a tongue twister, NSA-AI report is a push for the United States to marshal international AI partnerships, in part through recommendations to open a strategic dialogue for emerging technologies with the EU and for the Departments of State and Defense to provide policy guidance on and support for NATO's AI initiatives. The NSCAI report's recommendations recognize the historic success of the United States defensive and strategic partnerships, also the potency of larger reserves of data for developing AI technologies, and the emergence of China as a strategic competitor in the field. Now, however, some challenges to this cooperation remain. The EU, NATO, and the United States maintain different priorities and frameworks on AI and other emerging technologies. NATO prioritizes maintaining military interoperability among its member states and encouraging innovative leadership. The EU looks to developing dual ecosystems of excellence and trust. It thereby tries to emphasize socioeconomic and ethical regulation of the modern technologies while coordinating among its member states. And the United States, well, the United States might be able to leverage its massive private sector and considerable military funding for AI development. However, data sharing and coordination, which is the lifeblood of AI, is a challenge between, on one hand, general data protection regulation and regulations, and private shield multinational platform corporations and other data privacy legislation. So dialogue is more important than ever. And this event is the first public high-level forum among NATO, the NSCAI, and the EU on the strategic discussion required to overcome those challenges. And only a continued dialogue at the highest levels can empower the transatlantic partners to identify common goals and to develop a cooperative strategy for a technological race that cannot be won by domestic initiatives alone. So, with that background and that context, it is really my distinct pleasure to introduce the two moderators for this panel. The director of the Atlantic Council's GeoTech Center, Dr. David Bray, and also Dr. Fran Burwell, who is a distinguished fellow with the Future Europe Initiative. Over to you both, David and Fran, and welcome to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I think you set the stage very politely and very centered on how we need to have a dialogue together. Again, the Atlantic Council's motto of we need to be stronger together with allies. I look forward to the conversation we're now going to have with our august members here today. I'd like to turn first to Dr. Schmidt and Secretary Work. If you could collectively summarize for us, recognizing that might be really hard to do in a short period of time, but if you could collectively summarize the NSCAI's report recommendations so that we can have a sense of where you're recommending we might be able to go together.
Well, thank you to all the ambassadors to the Atlantic Council and all of their participants of this. When I think about Europe and the United States, I think of a partnership that has existed post-World War II that has provided extraordinary economic growth, military security, national security, and cultural enrichment that has benefited all of us enormously. The partnerships that were built by the generation before us have stood us well. It is time for us to build another partnership, and this is a partnership around artificial intelligence. Part of the reason here is that AI is a game changer. It's a game changer, excuse me. It's the most powerful tool in generations for expanding knowledge, increasing prosperity, enriching the human experience, and expanding freedom. And one way to understand this is that all of the fundamental accomplishments in science and engineering are now going to have AI as a fundamental component. If you think about the extraordinary industries of Europe, I'm thinking about the drug discovery industries, various materials industries, and so forth. All of them will be critically affected by AI. The inverse is also true in the United States. So we're going to have strong AI partnerships and transatlantic cooperation. By ourselves, we won't be able to do it. And if it's hard to understand why, even though America seems like it's pretty large, China is much, much larger and has plenty of really smart people. We need all the top brains that are available to us in all of the Atlantic Council countries working to build platforms that have our values and our commitments to protecting individual rights, restoring commercial competition built on fair rules, and strengthening defense alliances that have kept the peace in Europe and in the Pacific for my whole life. So we basically have a series of recommendations, which Bob will take you through, which have to do with expediting responsible development and fielding of AI by NATO and member states. That in particular, the United States should build resilient AI partnerships and pursue a strategic dialogue for emerging technologies, which is not just AI, but AI and a number of others with the European Union. And I think everyone's kind of figured out that the China threat is very real. We want to make sure that our technologies are the ones that are adopted worldwide. So we're proposing and we're calling for a very strong alliance among the democratic nations for this techno-economic competition. So when I look at it, the EU and its 27 member states, and of course I'm including Britain in this context, are the most important political, diplomatic, and commercial partners of the United States for all sorts of long-standing reasons and trips and the way we communicate and so forth and so on. And I don't need to remind everybody here the importance of NATO. So what I want to say to you is that America believes in partnerships and needs partners. We believe that the right partnerships start with the natural Atlantic Council partners that we have worked with for so many decades. Bob, do you want to sort of take us through our recommendations?
Sure. Thank you, Eric. And thanks to the Atlantic Council for sponsoring this event. This, as Ambassador Dobriansky said, this is our third quarterly report. And the theme of our first report was how do we get the United States organized for a technical competition with a near peer. And so we looked at things like developing a national resource cloud and doubling the amount of research dollars spent on AI. The second quarter really focused on talent, which the Commission unanimously agrees is the key to winning a long-term technical competition in AI. And this third quarterly report, as Eric said, really focused on allies and partnerships, specifically among the democratic nations, because we recognize that the technological competition with China particularly is based upon values. The values of the governing entities will be reflected in the way the technology is used. And so you can see that China will use these type of technologies to surveil its population, to suppress minorities. They have no real concern over personal privacy. Their values are much different than the United States values, and we suppose all democratic nations also. So we really had three kind of focus on, this allies and partners. First, we wanted to focus on NATO. As Eric said, we consider NATO and our Five Eyes partners particularly as absolutely central to this competition. We have to share our data. We have to share our values. So NATO is a big, big part, and we want to provide clear guidance and support to NATO's AI initiatives in all their forms, and to expedite the responsible development and fielding of AI by NATO and its member states. Then we looked at multilateral organizations, the EU being critical among them. As Eric said, the long-standing ties that we have had since the end of World War II, we consider absolutely central to the U.S. national security. And we would hope over time that we grow closer with EU on matters concerning AI. And then finally, we looked into the Asia-Pacific region, the Indo-Pacific region, and we recommended having a strategic tech partnership or alliance with India. A huge democratic state with enormous technological potential. So we really focused on these three things. The announcement last week of a new bilateral dialogue between the European External Action Service and the U.S. Department of State on China demonstrates the growing convergence between how we view the technological competition and what we have to do. And we also want to have a very positive AI agenda in which we address ethical concerns, moral concerns, as well as any legal concerns, especially as they relate to international humanitarian law. So with that, we very much look forward to your questions, and I'm looking forward to the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary Work, and also Dr. Schmidt. Let me turn now to welcome the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, Ambassador Mircea Geoană. Ambassador Geoană, you have just heard the basic outline of the NSC AI's report. Perhaps you could say a few words on the way NATO is looking at artificial intelligence. I know there was a report that came out earlier this year. And I'd ask you also to say something about the fact that NATO has a lot of different capabilities among its member nations' militaries, and interoperability has long been a discussion point within the alliance. So if you could speak to those questions and NATO's general approach to AI, be much appreciated.
Oh, thank you, friend. So good to see you again. And
good to see you too.
Also, Paula Dobriansky, I've seen her before. We are dear friends from the old days in Washington when we were working on expanding NATO, and here I am now. Thank you so very much for the invitation, Atlantic Council, the Center for Global Technology, and also the National Security Commission on AI. I'm privileged to be part of such a great group. Also, Dr. Eric Schmidt and Secretary Work, thank you so much for leading this effort. And also, I'm very happy that Ambassador Jorgensen, representing Executive Vice President Vestager will be joining us on this issue. Let me say a few words on where NATO stands on this issue. First, Secretary General Stoltenberg asked me when I joined NATO in this position roughly 1 year ago to be what he calls the innovation champion across the NATO enterprise. And I'm chairing the innovation board in NATO. Tomorrow we'll have a new board meeting. And the idea is to basically harness all the, let's say, talent, find the things that are not moving as fast and as agile as we'd have wanted. So we have a significant body of work on innovation and what we call emerging disruptive technologies. When our leaders met in London in December 2019, they instructed us, and we are delivering on that tasking from our leaders, to work on a roadmap for emerging disruptive technologies. There are 7 sub-domains of this work, which is now undergoing and which is making progress. Of course, AI and big data, quantum computing, biotechnology, human enhancement, new materials, space. And I was very much pleased and intrigued by reading the last report, the third quarter report that was mentioned. And also my colleagues here in NATO read it with great attention, and we really cherish the insight and the sophistication of this report in trying to see, on the one hand, how we make sure that we keep the right balance between the traditional way to keep our deterrence and defense, because there's still some threats to our security as an alliance of representing 1 billion people, 30 nations, that are still traditional, while making rapidly and systematically the transition towards the new era, that new technologies and AI is the driving force around this thing. So how to find the right balance between these two situations. Secondly, we also have identified some obstacles, because, and I think also governments in general have this difficulty that sometimes they're too slow. While the private sector, venture capital, innovation, academia, universities are far more agile, sometimes big bureaucracies are much slower in adjusting. So I think this is something that I think we have to learn from our US friends, from our British friends, from our German or French friends and other allies that have been, let's say, leading this work. And I think this transfer of best practices across the alliance is something which is very, very, very important. Thirdly, we call it here the triple helix. In your report, you call it the triangular alliance, if I'm not mistaken, between the public sector, governments, private sector, academia, and also civil society. So I think harnessing this synergy between the 3 pillars of our democratic societies is not only smart in terms of business and in terms of adaptability, but is also, I think, our main competitive advantage in our competition with our authoritarian rivals. Because in the end, harnessing the whole talent that we have in our open societies, democratic societies, in public sector, in private sector, and also in academia and civil society, is, I think, the fundamental difference between us and what we stand for in terms of values and our competitors. And I think, in the end, this is something that will make us prevail. In broader terms, we're also looking into something that made this great alliance of ours, 71 years of success, the most successful alliance in human history, be so successful. 2 things. Number one, we kept our values to keep us together, and this is, if you want, the meta proposition of the transatlantic bond, but also we kept always our technological edge. They go hand in hand, because the moment you lose, God forbid, this technological edge, and our competitors are investing heavily, as Eric mentioned, into high-end capabilities, then not only the last 7 decades of the transatlantic bond would be in jeopardy, but also a few centuries of Western domination on technology would be contested. This leads me to the next point in my assessment. You're right, and I think, Secretary Ward, you are just indicating the right thing. Even U.S. and Europe, not even NATO and the EU, not even the traditional geographical West, would not be enough in terms of critical mass to cope with such a formidable challenge and challenges. This is why opening up to our like-minded democratic partners from all over the world, you mentioned in India Pacific. In NATO, we have exceptionally close partnership relationships with Australia, with New Zealand, with Japan, and South Korea. I also witnessed that, I think today, US and India established a exceptionally important breakthrough in terms of defense cooperation, and also their propositions in engaging the largest democracy in terms of population in the world much closer to what we do. There are also other nations, our partners. Israel is one, many others, who are sharing the same values, and I do believe that a sort of a broader, let's say, synergistic approach is something that we should do. I also love very much, and I'm intrigued and positively inclined to follow through, not necessarily today, but also in the next few weeks and months and years, in this idea to have a sort of a transatlantic digital community. It was in the report someplace. I read it with great attention. I'm not here to say that I digested it fully, but I'm saying that I do believe that bringing the talent of our universities, the talent of our researchers, the talent of our young entrepreneurs, the talent of our startups, the talent of our people in government.
Ambassador, yes, I think that's that would be
something that I believe we should harness. So I stop here,
absolutely.
Friend, because I sense your nervousness about my long intervention. So I'll put not a stop, but a comma to my first intervention.
Absolutely, and we hope very much to come back to this idea of a strategic dialogue and of a community working on these technologies. But let me go to Ambassador Kim Jørgensen. The EU has published a white paper on AI and has a very ambitious agenda on AI. Could you speak about what those ambitions are, and particularly how you, because the EU has said this quite a lot, how you think about AI in terms of being ethical and human-centric, and how this relates to AI in the national security sphere, as the NSC AI has outlined.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for letting me join. I think I will start on the first part of it, and being somebody who has a major a long time ago in U.S. history and politics, and have spent two legs in my career. I've had two legs, one on EU and another one on transatlantic relations. I'm really happy to be participating today, and starting out actually what Secretary Work said, that he hoped we will grow closer on the same approach on AI. I think actually we are seeing that by the day. It's really my feeling, speaking with a lot of transatlantics and the US, that we are getting closer, and therefore it's obviously also a very good idea to work closer together on the digital technologies, because they don't stop at the borders, and we do have to find I think a common approach. And you mentioned this word, and a human-centric way, which is the way we have taken it at EU level. But at the same time, we basically want a global partnership on AI, and we want to cooperate with, as also was said by Ambassador just now, Mircea, that we also want to talk with all the sort of the democracies in the world. We have launched a broad public debate around the use of artificial intelligence and the use of data to feed it at the beginning of this year. We have, since the launch of the White Book in February, been consulting widely on our ideas to create both an ecosystem of excellence and an ecosystem of trust. And just like the US, actually, the ecosystem of trust will entail much more spending on research on AI, but also first-class connectivity, high-performance computing, the creation of data spaces, and of course we need to invest in digital skills. So looking at the recommendation on your part, I think actually we have come to very similar conclusions on both sides of the Atlantic. The COVID crisis have of course further confirmed the need for this forward-looking agenda, as digital technologies will not only help us to improve our health system and future responses to such crisis system. If there might be one difference compared to the US approach, that's actually the more defense-focused angle that US has, and I don't think that it's not a surprise. It's natural that US, being the US, has a more national security defense on dimension on AI than the European Union will have. And again, also much more natural that NATO has more focus on security in the sense of the hard sense of security. We are, of course, also looking at other dimensions of AI, which have a lot of security implication, cybersecurity and data governance and how to do things. And we need also to cooperate, I think, better and much more on this. But at the EU side, we focus on the huge potential that AI offers to make our economies more sustainable and to meet a wide range of society needs, greening and also the digital transformation, and also how it can improve our health and educational systems. Another difference might be on the approach on how to use legislative instruments. EU is built on law and legislation, maybe too much, where US tend to give preference to self-regulatory forces. We are right now working on coming forward with legislation next year, where I think we will take what we call a very high-risk approach, meaning that if you take a pyramid, then it will only be at the very, very top in the extreme sensitive areas where I think personally that we would need to have hardcore sort of legislation, and then in the lower risk area, it will be much more like a a much more voluntary basis system, and there might be areas where I don't think we need regulation at all. And again, speaking on all the number of contacts we have had within the last year, it's certainly my impression that we are actually growing closer together, and we should continue this way. So thanks a lot for letting me have the floor.
Excellent, Ambassador Jorgensen, and I found that risk-based approach to be quite fascinating, so we look forward to learning more in the weeks and months ahead. So this is a great start to the dialogue. We are about 30 minutes in, so it points to that we need to have more dialogue, but recognizing that we have only 30 minutes left to this specific session, I'm gonna turn first to Dr. Schmidt and then to Secretary Work for your thoughts on what are some ways forward that Europe and the US can move forward, both from a defense perspective, but from also a society perspective together? And then also, if you would care to answer briefly on what is the appropriate way to engage China, given its role in AI globally as well?
So thank you. Just real briefly, the Commission is actually proposing a blueprint for AI cooperation that includes operational guidance across defense and security cooperation, standards and norms, joint R&D, data sharing, innovation, how we work together, hiring people, countering information operations from our opponents, and benefiting humanity. I mean, we've got it all mapped out as a starting point for consideration. What I would say the most important thing to do is to get the human capital that is available in Europe and in the United States working on this. We are strong when we are innovating in these spaces, and combined, we can build amazing platforms. The core issue that we believe about China is that China is catching up fairly quickly. The West is still ahead. China has made this a national priority. There's every reason to believe that with a larger market and the kind of scalable engineering that they're doing, they can be or already significant peer competitors in this area. If China wins in one of the key platform areas and we start using Chinese platforms as opposed to Western platforms, this will have all sorts of negative impacts on our society. So this is a battle that's important for us to win for both business reasons, ethical reasons, and national security reasons. Bob?
Nope, you may be muted, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you. I certainly was. We proposed a US-EU strategic dialogue for emerging technologies. And here are some of the items that we were really thinking that we could work on. One are joint R&D projects in areas like privacy-preserving technologies and test, evaluation, validation, and verification. These are absolutely critical for building trust in responsible AI, which is especially important in our democratic societies. We think the US role in the EU's Horizon Europe and Digital Europe framework should be expanded to the extent possible. And we should really work on operationalized AI principles and working through multilateral forums to shape AI norms and technical standards. Picking up on what Eric said, we do not want the Chinese to be developing global norms and technical standards for AI technologies. It's important that democratic nations lead that charge. And both of us need to counter and compete against disinformation enabled by AI. And this is another fruitful area of research that we recommended. Now, in terms of society, one of the things we thought would be to develop a trusted city initiative. And this would provide a democratic, secure alternative to smart cities and surveillance technologies that further authoritarianism and violate personal privacy and civil liberties. This would be virtuous in two regards. First, it would help us develop our norms and standards, get through the ethical, moral, and legal questions about them, but provide an alternative to the Chinese approach, which would really help us in the long-term competition, especially with other democratic nations.
Excellent. Thank you, Secretary Work. I'd now like to turn to our European counterparts and ask the same question, sort of first to Ambassador Geoană. NATO, of course, recognizing you operate in a security context, of course, with US and Europe as a whole, would be first interested in your thoughts about what are things we could do in a security context, but then also recognize that NATO is more than just security. It's also, it does have a society function as well. Interested in your thoughts there, and then how do we address the role of China? Then I'd like to turn to Ambassador Jorgensen with the same question as well.
No, thank you so much. I think the suggestions made earlier make a lot of sense. I will stop 1 second on what we call the power of standardization. Because if we recognize, and that's a fact, that the EU and the Commission, European Parliament, but also national governments and national parliaments have the power of regulation. And that's a very important issue, how we regulate, how we legislate, how we establish norms and laws according to our values and you know, common denominator, which is of course a value-based proposition. But NATO has developed over time, and this is probably the place where the gold standard on standards on when it comes to military and security things is with us. And if I'll be giving an example, a precursor, if you want, to something even more ambitious on the transatlantic realm and also on the global democratic realm on this topic of AI and related issues, I will say the very interesting recent expertise and experience we had on 5G. Because it's also about China, it's also about revolutionary technology that will change, a game changer as well in a different, where AI is also part, of course. But initially, it seemed like a sort of a US-driven, you know, imperative of sorts. And you've seen how allies in Europe, I mentioned now Europe, allies in Europe, started with a sort of a quite different response to this legitimate concern coming from the US that, listen, we have to make sure that our communication systems are safe and secure. And speaking of NATO and military and intelligence and national governments and local governments and smart cities, secure cities, and secure citizens in the end, we have to make sure that we don't have you know, things that could be detrimental to our security. And I've seen in a period of time of common work, with Undersecretary Keith visiting repeatedly Europe and also visiting NATO and seeing the Commission as well. I've seen how the European Union's and European Commission's 5G toolbox is complementing the standard set on resilience on 5G by NATO. So I'm saying if we'll be in the situation to put together, while recognizing the differences of political culture, of the way in which we also construct our economies, we are not identical. God bless us, we are not the same. But I do believe that this is where we can build a lot in terms of bringing this issue. Because if China has developed something, and I think this is something to what just referred by Secretary Ward just a minute ago, for the first time in our, let's say, history on technology, one competitor, China, has at the same time all the ingredients of global supremacy on technology, because they also have the technology itself, they develop technology now, intellectual property theft, but also local, domestic, homegrown innovation ecosystem. They do have it. Secondly, they have the market. And not only the huge Chinese domestic market, but also many other countries, Belt and Road Initiative, lots of nations that today are still ambivalent, sometimes reticent to take stronger measures on this one. And also the power of standardization, which is coming on that. So if you have this, if you want this three layer of what it represents, you know, the body of dominance and superiority in technology, we have to make sure that we bring everything that we have together. And I fully agree that NATO, EU, US, its allies from all over the world, we should really bring these things, create norms according to the values we cherish, and not allow the others to set the stage and set the competition that will be to their advantage.
Thank you very much for that, Ambassador. And I think you astutely painted the choices before us, and I think you also quite nicely framed it, thinking about how we can make sure we let our values that we share help lead our effort. I'd like to now turn to Ambassador Jorgensen for your thoughts as well, recognizing that you're probably coming from more of a perspective of civil society and social efforts, but also what can we do in terms of defense, and then thinking about how do we address China's role in AI globally as well.
Thanks a lot, and David. And also, as you said, on the defense and security context, the situation is a bit more complex on the European side, or at least on the EU side, as the competences lie primarily with our member states. So much of the cooperation will therefore have to take place on a bilateral basis. This being said, I believe that structured transatlantic cooperation on emerging technologies is really absolutely necessary, as we are so aligned on the fundamentals. And this is also why we have proposed the establishment of a Trade and Technology Council to coordinate on related policy. I think this is a very, very important point on our side. And then on China, of course, difficult point. Last month, Executive Vice President Vestager had the first EU-China high-level digital dialogue. It was actually quite constructive, but we also made it very, very clear that on AI, we want to have a discussion, and this is one of the areas where we basically disagree, and I think we will continue to really make a point out of also insisting on the point where we disagree, and AI being certainly one of them. And we have seen last year China signing up to the G20 principles on AI. However, the reality we see in the way certain AI technologies are being rolled out, particularly in the surveillance space, are hardly in line with those principles. So that was part of what was stressed on our part at that meeting. But in the end, I think the best way to promote our approach now, speaking both at transatlantic and US and in EU and NATO as well, I assume, is to lead the development of technology and to be at the forefront when it comes to setting the global standard. Because I think the larger the combined economic weight of our aligned partner, the more effective we will be in promoting our standard and to set the standard. I believe that if like-minded partners can provide a solid model for AI governance that upholds fundamental rights and show technology works for people and not the other way around, I think many countries around the world would actually want to follow our model. We have seen Japan, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, India, a lot of countries wanting at least to come here to Brussels, to EU, and we are going the other way around to talk about this, and they want to promote a common model. So I think what we saw with privacy, I think we can also see the same thing on AI. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Ambassador Geoană, let me turn back to you and ask you to look ahead, maybe 6 months or so, to the next NATO summit or the next defense ministerial or foreign ministerial, and think about what you would like to have come out of that meeting in terms of AI and cooperation within the alliance. And I'm thinking in two directions. One is the education or alignment of the militaries of the alliance so that they have the capabilities and that they also have the ambitions to know how to use AI as technology comes into their equipment, but also what would be really useful for you at NATO to have from the United States as we move forward in our national defense with integrating AI.
Thank you, Fran. If I would be in the situation to ask for intellectual help, I'm asking for intellectual help because as we are getting closer to the next NATO leaders meeting or summit, we'll decide this in due course next year, 2021. It's clear that we have to have into the vision for the next period of our alliance, and this is what Secretary Stoltenberg coined as NATO 2030, an important piece on innovation, new technologies, transformation, of course on deterrence and defense and everything else we do. We had just the defense ministerial meeting just a few days ago, and already we have decided to put on the table of our leaders sometime next year the big issue of resilience. Now we are making progress on what we have been instructed to do in London 1 year ago by our leaders on emerging disruptive technologies. And I'm convinced that as our foreign ministers will be meeting in a few weeks' time, and then again the defense ministers in February, will be coming out of this process with stronger input for our leaders to decide on these issues. So this is why I'm making also a sort of an appeal to you and to the Commission, to the Atlantic Council, to our friends also in Europe, our friends in the EU, to think together what will make, let's say, the most sense and the most purpose for the NATO leaders to decide upon on this very important topic. Some of the suggestions you make, again, are very interesting. I think they make a lot of sense. I would suggest we try to get a little bit deeper. Our staffs, I understand, they're already in touch. We also have established an advisory board on new technologies here in NATO, helping me and the innovation board on these new things. Why not put the members of the Commission, our friends from US Congress, US administration, in touch also not only with us as an institution, but also to advisory board, because they are people that are very smart, including on AI. Eventually we could come with something that will make, a very powerful and forward-leaning big deliverable at the next NATO summit. I think this is what we should try to do. I'm here not only to tell you what we do, but also to learn from you and also see how can we make things together. And the last point on NATO EU. It's true that we are two different organizations in terms of the very definition of what we do. But there is this common thing. We have to keep our citizens safe, prosperous, and to live in a democratic society. So I think we have to bring all the arsenal, our toolboxes, our imagination, our strengths together in this direction. So a practical proposition after our conversation this afternoon in Brussels, this morning in America, is why not try to get a little bit from, and this is also for the co-chairs to decide, What do you believe? You believe we could also try to digest, to prepare, to get into our flows of work here in NATO, and I think we can make progress. And like always, many initiatives that came from the Atlantic Council previously in our recent history, this could make a lot of sense. And this is not only about AI. Let me say this very clearly. This is about new technologies and the new world that we are entering right now. And I do believe that for the future transatlantic bond and relationship, coming into some form of, if not coincidence or total overlap of our approaches between Europe and the US and our friends in Canada, we should do this. And the last thing, there was a question, how can you help us? I do believe that things that are done at a national level, the advisory board working with the Pentagon, the issues that are already tested in terms of funding, in terms of procurement, in terms of agility, in terms of harnessing talent. I read with vivid interest these suggestions on talent and investment, the AI challenge, all these kind of things that already tried successfully in ally nations, and why not also in partner countries from all over the world. We don't have the total control of everything, which is a smart idea. So I believe let's try to make out of this very important proposition to have a transatlantic digital ecosystem and the subcomponents into something that, if is practical, ambitious and practical at the same time, I have no problem in taking it over, and together with our American allies, together with European allies, together with European Union friends and strategic partners, eventually with other nations from around the world, to do something that is useful, ambitious, and I think more than necessary at this point in time.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I also wanted to come back and thank you for bringing up the 5G discussion, transatlantic discussion, because I think that's an example of a technological discussion that didn't start off so well, but then we started and really understood each other, came to understand each other and the concerns of each other, and I think it has become rather productive. So I think that is a way for us to look forward. Let me go to Ambassador Jørgensen again. And I'd like to ask you a couple of questions. One is, you had raised the idea of the Trade and Tech Council. Should it include trade, or should it be more narrowly focused? Would that be more productive? One of the other questions that one hears a lot here in the United States, though, about the way the EU is going forward with AI, is whether there will be access for US companies, or whether there will be restrictions in the European market. And I think that in terms of trust building, as we look at these things, this is something that probably needs to be addressed sooner rather than later, even though, given that your legislation is only in the very formative stage. Perhaps you could say a few words about that, but I also want to give you the opportunity to address the NSC-AI as they prepare their final report about what would be the things that you would find most beneficial in terms of starting a really vigorous collaborative dialogue. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. As I said at the very beginning of my first intervention, I think actually we have improved our dialogue, and I think we should just intensify this. I think one of the very first things that the Executive Vice President Vestager did just before actually starting this mandate was having a meeting with the White House Chief Tech Officer in Lisbon at a global tech summit where we had a very good discussion. And actually, I think both of us were at least surprised that I think our views was converging more than we had thought before the meeting. At least that was the take on our side. Whether the Trade and Tech Council should be more narrow focused, I would be more open on that. I think you can both have a trade and tech council which have sessions or sub-sessions that are more narrow or much more narrow, and I think that would most probably be a better approach. There will be a lot of broader issues that will need to be discussed there, but there would also be a need to be able to have more narrow discussions that then might take place in some kind of sub formats. I think that might be a better or one approach to take. The access for US companies to EU market, of course, is basically, of course, fundamental. I think one of the discussions that we will have and that we're having now is basically on data, on the access to public data, and whether a company would need to be established in EU to get a right to do these things. I think this is work in progress, and certainly something we would need to discuss. But one of the things where we are discussing here is access to public data, where I don't think there's a system anywhere in the world, or maybe I might be mistaken, where companies, European companies, can get access to public data in third countries. So that's one of the things where we're working now. I don't expect, and I cannot imagine that we will kind of seal off of Europe. And what we will do in terms of legislation will certainly be fully compliant with our obligations in terms of international trade. Thanks.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Ambassador Jorgensen. That points to a way forward that we can work together. And I think you touched upon the data part, which I think is going to be interesting for further conversations, because that's going to be the thing that needs to be sorted out between the United States and Europe to make AI work. All right, I would now like to turn to Dr. Schmidt and Secretary Work to close for us. Would be interested in your thoughts as to maybe 2 to 3 very short recommendations as to how do we translate this dialogue into action for the next 6 to 9 months ahead. Dr. Schmidt, you first.
Well, again, we have a set of specific proposals which I would offer in the document. Perhaps the most important is to begin with some form of summit to talk about these issues. I can tell you from my own experience that the most important thing is talent. Figuring out ways to identify the talent that can build this. This stuff is really hard. It's very different from anything people have seen before. It takes a different management regime. I would love to see NATO have this kind of talent inside of it. We've been pushing hard for the Defense Department to have similar talent inside of it. And so my core message would be, first, we should have a summit. And second, every country should have a strategy for surfacing top talent and getting it into the right places, both for national security, but also for their competitiveness globally. Bob?
Excellent. Thank you for that. And that does emphasize the people side. So Secretary of Work, similarly, your recommendations on the way forward?
Yeah, picking up on Eric's, I think, really good idea for a summit. We should really try to come up with a plan of action to create a coalition of digital democracies. How would we go about doing that? How would we seek out democratic partners around the world to exploit all of the values and all of the talent worldwide? The second thing is, I really like the idea of an EU-US digital ecosystem. The summit should also talk about what are the concrete steps we could do for that. So, as I said, the smart kind of cities initiative that would work to give a viable alternative to the way the Chinese are developing smart cities, I think would be very, very good for the long-term competition between democratic and authoritarian regimes. And lastly, I think NATO really needs to focus on what are the hardcore national security issues in using AI in a coalition. How do we do multi-level security? What are the things that we would tolerate as democracies? How far would we allow AI-enabled autonomy to go? And really have NATO have a series of war games and a series of exchanges so that we can recommend to the democratic political leaders the way forward so that we don't get crosswise with our political leaders.
Excellent. Thank you, Secretary. And I want to thank all of our speakers today. This has been a very illustrative conversation. Real quick, Fran, I'll turn to you and see if you heard any big takeaways for what we should be thinking about between Europe and the US and possibly how we advance this globally.
Well, one of the things that I heard very definitely was that it's not just about AI. We've gone through the 5G discussion. We should look at this report and the work of the NCSAI as one of the mechanisms, one of the models for addressing a number of these issues that we in the transatlantic space are going to have to deal with. Secondly, cooperation is really hard. It's easier for each country to kind of say, I'll do it on my own. And for that reason, mechanisms really matter. And one of the things that I think has been especially rich in this discussion has been putting forward different formats, whether it's a NATO summit or leaders meeting, whether it is a summit across the Atlantic, or more generally US-EU, something that we haven't seen for a while, or whether it is a coalition of digital democracies. I think this is really important to be thinking about different formats that start at the top, because if you don't have energy from the top, it doesn't trickle down. And the last thing I'd say is that we need to think about standards. And I'm very heartened by the discussions, especially from Secretary Work, about trusted cities versus smart cities, about privacy protecting mechanisms. These are all things that I think the US could say more about. Europe has been a leader in this area, but we need to be leaders together in this area. And I'll stop there.
Well said, Fran. I'll wrap with a closing too before we close for the hour, just by saying briefly that I really appreciate everyone's remarks that this is not just about US and Europe, recognizing there is a key fundamental partnership that goes back several decades that we want to build upon. But as you said, Fran, that we want to think about how this can be a coalition of all digital democracies. So it's not just about AI, but it's about how can we widen that club. I particularly like the comments that were made by the NSCAI that says start first and foremost with the talent. And that's why, again, we want to go, again, stronger together with allies, because the talent, ideally, we want to be in any place that is trying to embrace democratic values. And we ideally want to work towards widening that club in the years and decades ahead. So with that, again, I want to thank all our august speakers. I also want to thank the ambassador for opening. And again, from the Atlantic Council, we look forward to continuing towards action steps together, stronger together with allies. Thank you.